Welcome to Drive the Daf, clear, structured explanation of the daily daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Pesachim Daf Pei Beis talks about the burning of karbanos that are apostle and contains one Mishnah. The beginning of the daf until the Mishnah is discussing how you burn it and using what wood you burn it. And then the Mishnah launches us into the topic of which karbanos are fitting to be burned right away and which have to wait until they become nicer, until they get another psul, because the psul that they have is not sufficient enough to allow them to be burned. The Gemara will look for the source of burning altogether for certain karbanos, and the Gemara will discuss the machlokas on the topic of when you need to leave them before you can burn them, and narrow down the machlokas, which we'll see on that subject in the Mishnah. So the first issue of the Gemara is, where do you burn meat of a carbon that has to be burnt, and using what wood? Our Mishnah had said that if it's just a little bit of meat, if it's not a majority of the carbon, then you burn it wherever you want within its zone, within wherever it's allowed to be taken, which for the carbon, Pesach and Shlamim, for example, is in Yerushalayim, and use your own wood. The Gemara says there's a contradiction to that. There's a brisa that says that if you're carrying a little bit of meat with you and you don't realize, and you travel outside of the place where it's allowed to be taken, so it's outside Yerushalayim, so where do you so you have to burn it now. There's a psul. The fact that it was taken outside of its proper zone is a psul. It has to be burned. We already have to burn it. So it says if you're within the furthest place that you could see Yerushalayim, you're within sight of Yerushalayim, you have to go back to the base of Mikdash and burn it using Mizbeach wood. If ever you're outside Yerushalayim, you don't have to. You can just burn it right there where you are. So what we see from here is that really the main halacha is that if you have just a little bit of meat with you, you're supposed to go back to the base of Mikdash and burn it in the base of Sreifa with Mizbeach wood. How come in our Mishnah we say that you don't have to? So Gemara gives three resolutions to this contradiction. One is that the Brisa is talking about somebody who doesn't have wood. He's a guest. He's visiting Yerushalayim and doesn't have his own wood. That is Rav Papa's answer. That is Rav Chama Bar Ukva's answer. Rav Papa's answer is, we're talking about a guy who's traveling, right? If he's traveling, so he's on the road, he doesn't have wood. Even if he lives in Yerushalayim, but he's already set out on the road, he doesn't have to go back and start opening up his house and getting his wood. That's the whole operation. Once he's already on the road, we don't consider it to be an issue. Now, Rav Papa's pshat fits in the Mishnah better because the Brisa was talking about somebody who was on the road. It said he was leaving Yerushalayim. He was traveling. So the Gemara says that Rav Zvid defends Rav Chaim Bar Ukva's position and says that the original answer we gave, that the guy who can use Mizbeach wood as a guest, that also fits very nicely, because the Mishnah at the end of Daf Pei Aleph had clearly said that the stingy people would use Mizbeach wood to burn it. They didn't want to use up their own wood on the burning. So the Gemara says that a guest becomes like a stingy person. He's not stingy, but he doesn't have wood, just like the stingy person can't spare wood. And therefore it fits beautifully into the Mishnah, which says that he does have to burn it in the Beis Sreifa using the wood of the Mizbeach. Okay, now the Gemara brings the Brisa, which discusses what happens if somebody wants to use his own wood to burn it in front of the Beis Sreifa by the Mizbeach, or he wants to use Mizbeach wood to burn in his own house. So the Brisa says as follows: if you want to burn it in your own house using Mizbeach wood, we do not let you do that. The Gemara explains the reason is that if you have Mizbeach wood in your house, you can end up using it for other things, and that's going to be problematic. Also, the Brisa says if you want to burn it in the Beis HaMikdash's Beis HaSreifa using your own wood, we also don't allow that. So the Gemara says, why not? So the Gemara says the problem is that you may bring it home, and if you bring it home, people are going to think you're taking home Mizbeach wood, and of course that would be stealing. You're not allowed to do that. The Gemara gives another reason. The Gemara says we don't want you to bring your own wood to the Beis HaMikdash, because then people who can't afford to bring their own wood will be embarrassed that they have to use Mizbeach wood. Now the Gemara says, what's the difference between the two answers? The Gemara says that the difference is if the wood you're using is disqualified from Mizbeach wood. Mizbeach wood had to be good, solid wood that burns for a long time. If you have light wood that burns quickly, that couldn't be Mizbeach wood, and nobody will suspect you of taking it home. When you take it home, nobody will suspect that you've taken home Mizbeach wood. Okay, now the Gemara brings another Mishnah, which is from Pesachim Daf, which happens to have a similar structure to this conversation. Mishnah says that the Kohanim who became Tameh overnight, the person who was in charge would stand them at the entrance gate in the east, where everybody came in, to the Beis HaMikdash. Everybody should see that these people are Tameh. What's the reason? So Gemara says one reason was in order to embarrass them. They should not have allowed themselves to become Tameh if they have to do the Avodah. The Gemara says another reason might be because we want everybody to see that to tell me, so people shouldn't suspect them of not bothering to do the avodah because they're busy working, busy doing their own employment. The Gemara says, what's the difference between the two explanations? The difference is somebody who everybody knows doesn't have a job because he's a high class aristocrat, so there is no suspicion that he was too busy working, or somebody whose work is very light and not very lucrative, like somebody who braids ropes for a living. Nobody would think that he was too busy working and that's why he didn't show up, and therefore you don't have to stand him at the gates of the Beis HaMikdash. Everybody should see that he is tamei. The next Mishnah discusses which karbanos you're allowed to burn right away and which have to wait until a night passes. What's the issue? The issue is as follows. You're not allowed to just burn kachim for no reason. In order for you to be able to burn it, it has to have an innate psol, a psol which makes it ruined, and then you're allowed to burn it. What happens if you have a carbon which you can't use, but the psol is not innate? There's nothing wrong with the carbon itself. So you might possibly have to create a psol. Now, you're not allowed to create a psol, but just by leaving it overnight is what the Chazal call ibur tzura. It spoils, it loses its look. Leaving it overnight, it gets the psol of nicer almost, and then you can burn it following. Now, if we're talking about a carbon Pesach, the psol that it would get would be leaving it overnight, and then it would be ready to be burned on the 15th of Nisan, which is Yom Tov, and you're not allowed to burn on Yom Tov, so then it would have to stay to the 16th. So if you could burn it right away, you could burn it on the 14th of Nisan before Yom Tov starts. If you can't burn it right away, it has to wait for the 16th. Now, the Mishnah divides karbanos into three categories. The Mishnah discusses two of them, and the Gemara brings in the third category. They are a psol in the carbon itself, in the flesh of the carbon, a psol in the owner, something outside the carbon, something not in the carbon itself, and a psol in the blood of the carbon. That's the one the Mishnah doesn't speak at. So the Mishnah says as follows. If the psol is in the flesh of the carbon itself, and it gives two examples. One, it went outside its limited enclosure. It went outside its zone, which as far as carbon Pesach would be outside Yerushalayim. Second psol is that the meat of the carbon became tamei. These are two psulim in the thing itself. You can burn it right away. Now, if it's an outside psol, like if the owners were not available, either the owners became tamei or they died. Now, no longer has anybody who could eat it. There isn't anybody who's registered for the carbon. So the carbon can't be used, but there's nothing innately wrong with it. Then you have to wait till it gets the psol of spoilage. You have to leave it overnight, and you can't burn it till the 16th. Now, the psol of blood is the same. It's an outside psol, and you would also have to leave it over to the 16th, but the Mishnah doesn't mention that. The Mishnah does bring a machlokes here. The Mishnah brings that Rav Yochanan ben Baruch disagrees about the psol of owners, and he says you're allowed to burn it right away because not having owners is an innate psol, and therefore it's psol innately. You don't have to wait; you can burn it right away. Now, the Gemara first discusses the sources that these psulim require burning altogether, and then it'll go into the machlokes between the Tanna Kama and Rav Yochanan ben Baruch about a carbon that lost its owners, whether you have to burn it right away or you have to wait. So, what is the source of the fact that a tamei carbon is burnt? So the Gemara says, well, there's a pasuk that says it explicitly: any meat of a carbon that becomes tamei has to be burnt. Okay, the Gemara says, well, how do you know the psol of yotzei? So the Gemara said, right, that it left its enclosure. So the Gemara says, this we're going to learn from a conversation between Moshe and Aaron. When the Chanukas HaMishkan was being performed, the Yemei Miluim, so there's a special carbon chatos that Aaron brought. Now, Aaron was supposed to eat the meat of that carbon chatos. That was a carbon chatos that was supposed to stay outside the Kodesh Kodashim. It wasn't supposed to go inside. It was an outside carbon. It was supposed to be out on the chatzar. And Aaron was supposed to eat the meat of that. Instead, he burned it. And Moshe was upset, and he said, why did you burn it? It's not like you went inside. It's not like it was brought inside the Kodesh, and therefore it became puzzle because it went outside of its correct zone. So why did you burn it? Why didn't you eat it? And Aaron answered, because my sons, Nadav and Avihu, just died, and I'm an Oinain, and an Oinain should probably not be eating karbanos. And Moshe agreed with him, and he said, correct, and therefore it has to be burnt. Now, what was Moshe telling him? He said that if it would have gone into the wrong zone, if it would have gone too far into Kodesh, it would have been in the Kodesh, then I would understand that it has to be burnt. But the expression that he used when he said that was, why didn't you eat it? Ki Kodesh Kodeshim hi. It's Kachay Kachim. Then he said, Lahuva is Dam el Kodesh Prima. Its blood wasn't brought inside. It wasn't brought into the Kodesh, so it wasn't in the wrong zone. So the Gemara points out the word Prima here is extra. We could just say Lahuva as Dam el Kodesh, and that's because he was asking him two things. First of all, it didn't leave its proper zone by going too far in, and he was also saying it didn't leave its proper zone by going too far out. So you see from this that Moshe Rabbeinu was saying that had it gone too far in and too far out, I would understand why you burned it. So over there we see the halacha that a carbon which leaves its proper zone has to be burnt. So now the Gemara says all this is talking about kachim kachim. It's talking about a carbon chatos. How do you know kachim kalam? As far as tameh, we don't have a problem because the pasuk we brought for tameh was talking about kachim kalam. And kal v'chomer kachim kachim has to be burnt if it becomes tameh. But this was talking about a carbon chatas. How do you know that kachim kalim, lighter kabbanos like a shlamim, how do you know that they also have to be burnt if they go outside of their proper zone? Then the Gemara also says, what is the source also? Or that a psul in the blood makes the carbon have to be burnt. We have a brayso that says if the blood is left overnight, or if it spills, or if it goes outside of its proper zone, all these things are a psul in the blood, it has to be burnt. We shall see a discussion whether it has to be burned immediately or it has to wait until it gets spoiled and it gets an innate psul, but it definitely has to be burnt. So what is the source for that? So the Gemara says that it's really halacha l'moshe misinai. All of these things are really halacha l'moshe misinai, and the Gemara quotes a brayso of Rav Shimon who makes this point. So Rav Shimon is looking for the sources for psulei karbanos, and he first says, well, there's a pasuk that says ba'kodesh ba'esh tisarif. So that's talking about a chatos, and it teaches me that a chatos has to be burnt, and that its burning has to be in the kodesh. Not only that applies to a chatos. How do you know about other kachim? And how do you know about other things that have the level of kedusha of kachim kalim, like the imurim of kachim kalim, that is the parts of shlamim that are supposed to go on the mizbeach? How do you know that they all have the same halacha? So the pasuk of b'kodesh b'eish tisarif also says bakol. It says v'kol b'kodesh b'eish tisarif. That teaches me all that. But then Rav Shimon goes further and says, how do you know kachim kalim? So on that he says that it has to be halacha l'moshe misinai. Once you have halacha l'moshe misinai that kachim kalim is supposed to be burnt, then you know everything is supposed to be burnt all through the same halacha l'moshe misinai. So Gemara says, well, then we have a lot of extra psukim here. First of all, the whole limud we had from the chatas of Aaron and Moshe told him you should have not burned it. Why do we need that whole limud? So the Gemara says, well, that's not extra. That was just a story that happened. The Gemara is telling you, the psukim are describing to you the incident that happened with the chatas. That's ma'aser shoya kachaya, the Gemara says. The Gemara says, okay, but why do we need the pasuk of habasar sheyiga b'chol tamei? Why do we need that? So the Gemara says, that's to teach me that tamei meat has to be burned. I would have thought that everything else has to be burnt, but tamei not. Why? Because tamei is something which could happen to chulin. Tamei could happen to everything. All other psulim can only happen to kachim. Yeah, if it's yoytze or pigol, any of these other things are kachim psulim. But tamei could happen to truma. Tamei could happen to all other kinds of things. So the psul of tamei, therefore, I may think is a very chulin kind of psul. If it's a chulin kind of psul, maybe it lowers the level of kedusha of the carbon to be like chulin, and it's not so holy anymore, and therefore no longer requires burning it, just enough to bury it so that people don't use it. But maybe tamei really wouldn't require it, and therefore you need a special pasuk to tell me besides halacha l'moshe misinai, tamei is burned as well. Okay, the Gemara says, why do we need the pasuk of b'kodesh b'eish tisarif? The Gemara says that's to teach me that it's supposed to be b'kodesh, that the burning is supposed to be in the kodesh hakadashim itself, and that's why all these psukim are needed. Okay, now discussing the chatas of Aaron, the Gemara notes that there is a limud that is brought by a brayso, brought by Rabbi Bar Avua. He happens to hold that every psul has to be left overnight before you're allowed to burn it. Even pigel, which is the most intense psul out there, you got to leave it overnight. How does he know that? So he has Gzeira Shava. The word ovoin is written by pigel, and the word ovoin is written by noiser. Noiser is a carbon which is left over its proper time, and it has to be burned. So there's the hekesh between the two, pigel and noiser, shows that in order for pigel to be burnable, it has to become noiser first. It has to be left over its proper time. And you learn from there to everything else. The Gemara asks, one second, but the Chatas of Aaron also says the word ovoin. So why don't we learn from pigel to ovoin, from pigel to the Chatas of Aaron using the word ovoin, that it does not have to be left over, just like the Chatas of Aaron was burned right away on the spot and it wasn't left over. So Gemara says you can't learn that because the Chatas of Aaron was one isolated incident, and it could be that was a special halacha for that time. It was a special carbon of the miluim with aninos. You wouldn't be able to learn from there to all other chatois, and therefore the fact that one was burnt right there on the spot shouldn't teach me, even through a hekesh, that other kabbanos have to be burned on the spot. We'd rather connect it with the word avain to noiser, that they have to be left over for a long time. Okay, this concludes the Gemara's discussion of the sources of all the tumas. Now the Gemara goes into the machlokes in our Mishnah. So as we've seen, this is a machlokes between the Tanakama and Rav Yochanan ben Breika about the psul that happens outside the carbon itself, a psul that happens to the owners. The owners either become tamei or they disappear. So you don't have owners anymore. So the Gemara said that the Tanakama says you have to leave it over. It's not considered enough of psul to excuse burning it. If Yochanan ben Breika says no, now you have a carbon with no owners. You have a carbon Pesach with no owners. That's an innate psul, and you're allowed to burn it. So the Gemara wants to know, this machlokes is talking about when the owners became tamei or they went AWOL, they died. That was before the blood was put on the Mizbeach or after the blood was put on the Mizbeach. Now, the Gemara says that if it's before the blood was put on the Mizbeach, that's a much more stricter, it's a much likely situation in which the carbon should be puzzle and you shouldn't have to wait in order to burn it. Why? Because there was never a time in which this carbon was kosher. Before you even brought the mater on the mizbeach, before you even brought the avoda which would allow the meat to be eaten, the meat was already unusable because there was nobody around to eat it. So there was never a time when it was kosher. So then I would understand that everybody would say that could be burned right away. It's more likely to say that can be burned right away. If, however, the blood was brought and then the owners disappeared or became tamei, so there was a moment there when the carbon was a kosher and it worked for the owners, and they could say, we don't need to bring Pesach Sheni, we had this kosher moment here. Okay, then something happened, it became tamei, whatever it is. But there was a kosher moment, and then it's more of a psul which is external, and it'll be more likely, more logical to say that you have to wait until it's left over in order to be able to burn it. So the Gemara brings a machlokes amaraim when this machlokes tanaim is. Rav Yosef says the machlokes is only in the lighter case where the owners became tamei or they died after Zrika and there was a kosher time, and therefore it's not such an apsal. If, however, they became tamei before Zrika's Adam, there was never a kosher time, everybody knew you could burn it right away. The Gemara has a kasha on this, and that's that there's a brisa that discusses the psulim of the owners and the psulim of the blood. As we had said in our introduction, there's those two categories of psulim. And this brisa says that both of them are considered to be external psulim that you have to wait for. And it puts owners together with the blood. That means that they are similar. Now, just like the psul of the blood, obviously the blood was never properly thrown in the mizbeach, the psul of the owners should also be a situation where the blood was not yet properly thrown in the mizbeach. And that would seem to indicate that there's at least somebody out there, the author of this brisa, who holds that when the blood was not thrown on the mizbeach yet, and the psul of the owners happened, you still have to wait. It's not considered to be an psul, you still have to wait. And according to the way Rav Yosef said it, everybody in that case agrees that you don't have to wait. So the Gemara therefore changes what Rav Yosef said, and Rav Yosef now says the machlokes is in the case where the blood was never brought, and there was never a kosher time. That's where they argue, that's where the Tanakama says that you have to burn it, you have to wait before you're allowed to burn it, and Rav Yochanan ben Breika says that you're allowed to burn it right away. If, however, it had a kosher time, there was a kosher time, then there wouldn't be a machlokes. Everybody would agree that that's an external psul, and even Rav Yochanan ben Breika would say that you can't burn it yet. You have to wait until a real psul happens, like the psul of nicer, a real and an innate psul, like the psul of nicer. Okay, that's clarifying Rav Yosef's understanding of where this machlokes is. Now the Gemara says Rav Yochanan disagrees. Rav Yochanan, the Amora, says that the machlokes tanaim is both in the case where the Tomas Habaylam happened before Zrikas Adam and where it happened after Zrikas Adam. And the Gemara says that what he's therefore essentially doing is he's saying that Rav Yochanan ben Breika argues on the Tanakama even after Zrikas Adam. He says you still could burn it right away, even though it's an outside. It seems to be more of an outside psul. The Gemara says that Rav Yochanan fits very well with something he said elsewhere, and that's that he said that Rabbi Nechemia fits with Rabbi Yochanan ben Breika. Who's Rabbi Nechemia? So there's a machlokes between Rabbi Nechemia and Rav Yehuda. What happened to Aaron's carbon? What was the psul there? We understand the psul had something to do with the fact that another Avihu had died. Aaron said, "V'atekrena, I see ka'ela, something like this happened. You think I'm going to eat it?" But what exactly was the problem? So Rav Yehuda said that he became tamei, and Moshe accused him of being tamei, and he said, "Ka'ela, that no, this happened to me." What Moshe had accused him of becoming tamei on purpose because he didn't want to eat it, and Aaron said, "No, it happened to me. Ka'ela, like this happened to me. I didn't do it on purpose." But Rabbi Nechemia disagrees, and he says the psul is the fact that he was an einain. An einain, somebody who just lost somebody close before the burial, is not allowed to eat karbanos. Nothing to do with being posel, and that's why he said ka'ela. He said, "Look what happened to me. I just lost my kids. That's ka'ela. I can't eat these karbanos now. I certainly can't eat this karban chatas." Anyway, but what we see from this is Rabbi Nechemia saying the psul is that he's an einain. The psul of aninus is not a psul that prevents you from doing Zrikas Adam. You could even do Zrikas Adam after it became an einain. It's not a psul on the carbon. You could go be Zoyrik the Dam. It's not like a carbon Pesach where the carbon becomes puzzle if nobody ate it and there's nobody around to eat it. It's a carbon chatas. Aaron can't eat it, fine, but there's nothing wrong with the carbon. You can still bring the carbon. It still works. So therefore, this is like a situation of where there was Zrikas Adam bekashas, because you could do Zrikas Adam now. So there's no problem with this Zrikas Adam. So that being the case, Rav Nechemia, according to Rav Yochanan, Rav Nechemia still says that Rav Nechemia still says that you could burn it right away. According to Rav Yochanan, it says Rav Nechemia fits in with Rav Yochanan ben Breika, because that's how he's understanding what happened in this carbon. And the carbon was burned right away. It didn't wait to burn it. It was burned immediately. So therefore, Rav Nechemia's opinion clearly shows that even if it would be after Zrikas Adam was performed correctly, still it could be burned right away, and that fits with the opinion of Rav Yochanan ben Breika, and that fits with Rav Yochanan, who says that Rav Yochanan ben Breika says his opinion even if the Zrikas Adam happened bekashrus. Now the Gemara says that the Rabbah adds that Rabbi Yossi Aglili also holds like this opinion of Rav Yochanan ben Breika and Rabbi Nechemia. What's the sugya of Rabbi Yossi Aglili? So the Gemara quotes a brisa. The brisa is a machlokes between Rabbi Yossi Aglili and the Chachamim. What happens when the blood of a karban chatas is supposed to be in the outside mizbeach? What happens when that's brought inside? We know that the halach is that it's a psul and it has to be burned, but what's the source for it? According to the Rabbanon, it's from a pasuk that says, if any chatas is what is brought inside, you have to burn. According to Rabbi Yossi Aglili, let's talk about something else. It's talking about a chatas that's supposed to be inside and has a psul for a different reason. But the source of a chatas whose blood was brought incorrectly inside the chesed that has to be burned, that's from the story of Aaron. Because Aaron's chatas, Moshe Rabbeinu said, if you would have brought the blood inside, I understand why you burned it and why you burned it right away. So now this is a case of psul of dam. It's a psul of blood. It's a case of psul of blood, and Rabbi Yossi Aglili is understanding that it was correct that had this psul of blood, it should be burned. Now, psul of blood is an external psul. Psul of blood, we said, goes together, right? We said in our brisa, which we quoted earlier, psul of blood goes together with a psul of the owners. So it's like an external psul, and yet Aaron would have correctly burned it right away had he been supposed to. So you see, like Rav Yochanan ben Breika, that an external psul requires burning, and that burning could even be right away. So this therefore shows that Rabbi Yossi Aglili holds like Rabbi Yochanan ben Breika that the psul could be burned right away, even if it's an external psul like blood or like the owner. The Gemara says, why didn't Rabbi Yochanan also add Rabbi Yossi Aglili? He added Rabbi Nechemia. Why didn't he add Rabbi Yossi Aglili? The Gemara says Rabbi Yochanan felt you can't compare a psul of blood to a psul of owners. I'm showing you sources of people hold that a psul of owners doesn't require to be left over to be burned until a day later. This is talking about Psal of Blood, who says you can learn from 1 to...
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.